In the previous video, I talked about conducting an experiment or a quasi-experiment. In this video, I'm going to talk about correlational research, which is really what students tend to think of when they first think of designing a classroom research project. So this is probably going to be the route you want to take, but I would caution you against organizing a correlational study because it's really easy to overinterpret the results or to get a result and think it means something that it doesn't. And most people will believe you because they don't understand the fundamental difference between correlational research and causal research. And causal research can only be done following the example, the design in the previous video, the experimental and quasi-experimental. So I've got a little list here of the differences between experiments and correlational studies. In both, you're collecting data in different conditions and comparing the results. The difference is, you can see here, and one of the main ones is that within an experiment and a quasi-experiment, there is assignment to conditions. So as the researcher, you are assigning students to different conditions. And again, that can be a within subjects design where the entire group is first subjected to one condition and the entire group is subjected to another condition. But it's important that there are multiple conditions because there has to be control. And so I listed it there at the end again. Control is essential in an experiment and a quasi-experiment. In a correlational study, there's generally no controls because you're not putting participants in different conditions. It's just you're collecting data of what's already happening. So it's like correlational research is like an experiment without any of the design and control. You're just jumping to the data collection part, and there is a huge drawback when you do it that way. But let's move on. Experiments can be used to test causal hypotheses. So in the previous video example, I was talking about whether or not group work improves student performance with vocabulary words as opposed to individual work. So the hypothesis is that group work will cause an improvement in student achievement with respect to vocabulary words. And so I would have to use an experiment to test the hypothesis. If I just looked at the differences, Mrs. Smith is using group work and Mr. Jones is using individual work. Let's just compare the results of both. What you have is a correlation, and you're not sure what the actual differences can be attributed to. Even if you find substantial differences between the achievement in both conditions, you didn't assign them to those conditions, so you don't know if there wasn't some other reason to explain. Oh, oops, sorry, my dog kind of bumped the table on her way out of the room. Her huff out of the room. Okay, so in correlational studies, you cannot test causality, and so that's the big drawback. And when you get correlational data and it's compelling, you're going to want to make changes to your teaching strategy, maybe to your entire institution, and it's going to seem like it's supported by the data you collected when in fact it isn't. So we'll look at that later. An experiment can test a hypothesis. A correlation can also test a hypothesis, but again, you can't provide as much explanation in a correlational study because you don't know what caused what. All you know is that there's a relationship that's present. And then finally, an experiment has lots of control. A correlation has no control generally. All right, so how might this work? So I mentioned earlier, this seems to come most naturally to my students. All you're doing is looking for a relationship between variables. So I just came up with 3 possible questions that you might be interested in. So what's the relationship between the length of recess time, so how much time students or kids get outside to play or whatever. So what's the relationship between recess time and then the number of in-class disciplinary sanctions? Name on the board, sent to the principal's office, expulsion, I guess, suspension, any other in-school sanctions. So those are two variables that we can look at their relationship. As one goes up, does the other go up or down? And I realize now that I didn't provide a correlational graph in this study, or in this set of slides. So I'll talk about that in a second. Who does better in fourth grade? Math, boys or girls? We can look at the relationship between gender and math achievement, or English or writing achievement, or oral skills. It doesn't matter. We can compare those two variables and see the relationship. And we might have the hypothesis, are bullied students more likely to see the school counselor than non-bullied students? And we might find data that shows that all the people who went to see the school counselor and then all the people who have been bullied and look for a relationship between those two are among non-bullied and bullied students. And so we can design a correlational study. We can collect data to test or to answer all of these questions or test these hypotheses. And usually you can do that finding pre-existing data. You don't need to design a study to create an opportunity to collect this data. And if you were interested in bullied versus non-bullied students, this might be as far as you can go, because it would be unethical to subject students to bullying to see what happens, even though that would be required in order for it to be an experiment. So if you're interested in something that is ethically problematic, you're probably going to have to rely on pre-existing conditions. So unfortunately, some students are bullied, and you could use that fact and try to study the fact that it's already happening. You can't go as far as to make a causal claim with your results, but you can collect some data because it's there already, and then try to interpret it as well as you can using correlational studies. So the big problem, well, let me go back, since I mentioned I didn't include this fundamental outcome. What you're doing in a correlational study is checking for a relationship. And there's really three types of relationships. The first is there's no relationship. So for example, the relationship between length of recess time and class disciplinary sanctions. You might find when you collect all of the data that short recess, like 10 to 20 minutes, and long recess, like 60 minutes plus, has no difference in class disciplinary sanctions. In other words, discipline is relatively constant, no matter how high or low recess time is. So that would be no relationship. Or there could be a positive relationship. As recess time goes up, class disciplinary sanctions also go up. So that would be a positive correlation. As one goes up, the other goes up. The other type of relationship would be a negative correlation. As recess time increases, class disciplinary sanctions decrease. So as one goes up, the other goes down. And we can state that either way. And so when you have a correlation, you can do it as a graph, which would look like a positive correlation would be, so x-axis here, and then y-axis here. I'm sorry, let's put the y-axis there for you. No, you'd be looking at it here. So y-axis, x-axis. In a positive correlation, as x goes up, y goes up. In a negative correlation, as x goes up, y goes down. And then in no relationship, you can't really draw a line because the scatter plot is everywhere. So the line might be horizontal or vertical, or there'd be no line. It's just a cloud of variable plots. I'm sorry I don't have that visualization, but type in types of correlations and you'll see all sorts of graphs demonstrating what I've just described. All right, so the big shortcoming is that correlational studies, while simple to conduct and collect data for, cannot give you causality. So there's two big problems. It could give you causality, but you won't know for sure because you won't know which variable was responsible for the other variable, and you won't know if there's a third variable that explains both of the two variables. So third variable that you didn't even think about, which might influence the other two. So I've taken two of those earlier examples, and I'm just describing them with the first shortcoming and the second shortcoming. So Imagine that when recess is extended, you find that there are fewer disciplinary sanctions, but you won't know why. You'll know that, okay, longer recess leads to fewer disciplinary sanctions, so there's a negative or a inverse relationship between those, a negative correlation. But it might not be the longer recess. It might just mean that students are spending less time in class now. So of course there's going to be fewer disciplinary sanctions because there isn't as much time for kids to get in trouble. They might even be more rambunctious. So if you actually tested number of sanctions per minute, maybe they're more rambunctious, but if you're counting overall sanctions, you're not really doing a very good job because there's this third variable. In other words, how much time they're spending in class. So you didn't even think about measuring that. And then imagine that bullied students are more likely to see the counselor. It could be the reason. So this is the reverse one. Imagine that students who go to the counselor are more likely to get bullied because they go to the counselor. So actually, it's going to the counselor that's causing them to get bullied, not the reverse. Or it could be the third variable. Kids might go to see the counselor if, say, they're on the autism spectrum and it's something that's required as part of the school support of the neurodevelopmental disorder. So this student is going to the counselor already for a different reason, and then they're getting bullied for that same reason. So there's social differences there. So now this third variable, the fact that someone's on the autism spectrum, is what's causing them to get bullied and causing them to go see the school counselor. So you might find that students who are bullied are more likely to see the school counselor and want to say there's a direct causal relationship there, but those are two examples as to why you can't go that far. So my dog just ran outside from this room, and now she's standing outside staring into this room barking at me. So she went outside to bark at me. She's getting a little bit old. So what's the conclusion here? Well, correlational research outcomes have limited implications for making changes. It can be compelling when you collect correlational data and find a positive or a negative correlation that's strong to say, oh, I figured out why the relationship is this way. But you can't go that far if what you collected was correlational data. You need to design an experiment to test that relationship to see if there is a direction that one variable causes the other, or the reverse, or if there's a third variable. You have to test that separately. I've seen it every year among college professors who are PhDs who see this compelling, this significant correlational data and say, oh, we need to make a change in line with this. They jump to a causal conclusion when the data is correlational in nature. And that is a mistake. That is not substantiated by the data. So as I mentioned earlier, you might be limited to doing a correlational study if the topic that you're interested in is one that's an ethically gray area, or even a straight up ethically red area. And so it might be as far as you can go. But if not, and you want to test the efficacy or the effectiveness of an instructional strategy or a classroom activity, I recommend finding a way to make it a quasi-experiment. But if you're just getting started, maybe design a way to collect correlational data just to maybe create more questions. So a good correlational study should generate more questions than it does answers. So it might point you in a couple of directions for future work.